What's up guys, Intellitech Studios here, and today we'll be doing the full in-depth review on the Dyson Ball DC15, the first ever ball Dyson to come out from Dyson. That sounded redundant, but either way. This machine came out in 2005 and it was a follow-up to 2004's Dyson DC14. Not only was this Dyson's first machine to include the ball technology, which basically is Dyson's own version of swivel steering, but in a more in a more complete way, meaning, oh, I just butchered that. But either way, the point is that it's Dyson's version of a swivel neck, and since it rides on the entirety of the ball instead of a simple swivel neck, the main benefit of it is that whenever you're actually turning, it actually helps steer in the direction that you're turning in instead of simply twisting the actual neck of the machine itself. It's steering the entire machine instead of just the neck itself. That's the main selling point of the ball. And of course, this is the first iteration of it with a very complex design mechanism, but you can't help but be fascinated with the absolute technology that they put into this back in the day. Now, this machine, like I said, it released in 2005. Don't you love that squeak? And it came in 4 different variants. This one is the most common one, the DC15 All Floors. And the second most common one, almost equally as common, is the DC15 Animal, which of course got the more advertising from Dyson. That one was even more expensive. This particular machine retailed for $500. The Animal retailed for $600. There also were a couple exclusive models like the DC15 Total Clean and the DC15 Full Kit. Those are both white with silver accents, but the full kit had a bit more white and a bit more orange on the design language. They both look identical in colorway to the DC14 Full Kit and the DC14 Total Clean, respectively. So pretty much all those models were adopted from the DC14, but the DC15 didn't have all the extra models that the DC14 had. After all, they weren't really necessary. So the DC15 just had the 2 main iterations and the 2 store exclusive iterations. Of course, they all function the same. The only practical difference besides the color was the price and the attachment packages that they came with. And the attachments are quite important on the DC15 because the DC15 uses its own fitting. I've heard some people erroneously state that the DC14's tools work on the DC15. That is not true. As we can tell when we compare the attachments, the actual attachments appear to be the same, but you can see that the actual DC15 is down to a smaller fitting. In fact, that fitting is nearly identical to the fitting on modern Dyson uprights. However, you can't actually fit the new attachments on modern Dyson uprights because these are friction fit instead of click lock. So we try to put this in, it's not going to actually connect. However, on the other side of the coin, if you do have an attachment from a modern Dyson, they actually will fit on the wand of the DC15. So if you happen to be using a DC15 at home and you lost the attachments and you can't find them, you can use modern Dyson attachments in a pinch. The one small caveat is that when you try to push those attachments onto the hose, they're ever so slightly too thick to push down all the way. So the tools will be a little bit loose and you'll be hearing the air rushing out of the hose when you try to use these on the DC15, which is a bit unfortunate, but you can still kind of use them, which is great because it means you do have access to the modern Dyson ecosystem, including the flat-out tool, articulating hard floor tool, tangle-free turbine, and this Dyson groom tool. And they do fit on the wand just fine, even if they do struggle a little bit on the hose. So if you're okay with using them on the wand, they fit perfectly, exactly as intended. Now, since we're on the topic of the hose and wand, we'll continue. Now, besides the strange fitting that I don't like as much as the 1.25" fitting on the older Dysons, or I should say on the brother model, I guess you'd say, on the competing DC14, the other model in the range. The DC15, since it has at its roots the same attachments as the DC14 with the exception of the fitting, my opinions on the DC14 tools are identically applicable to the DC15. The upholstery tool is really nice, and the fact that you can swivel it makes it very handy, although I've always said that these breakout holes for the airflow should be a little bit bigger, as it does make the tool whistle a little bit, and the air rushing out of it, like a lot of Dysons, is very loud, and it makes the machine way louder to use and harder on your ears and practice, especially if you're in a room that's not as good with sound deadening as other rooms in your house. So in certain rooms where you hear the air rushing through the attachment, the vacuum's going to feel way louder than it actually is. And this is a complaint that's continued even on the newest Dysons, but it's present here on the 15 as well. Thankfully, this tool is in good shape, and the lint or the velvet strips, I always forget what material these are thankfully not worn off. I've always said it'd be nice if they went all the way to the edges, but this is perfectly applicable. And again, this is always a great tool, both on the 14 and on this, way better than the newer Dyson tools. Dusting brush, again, same real thing that I've said about the 14. You can swivel it to make it straight to help it get into corners, and it's plenty soft. This may be a placebo, but it feels a little bit softer on the 15 than on all of my 14/07 dusting brushes, but it's also possible that could just be because it's more worn, so I can't really comment on if there's a quality difference there. But that works the same. And this brush I actually don't like quite as much as the combo tool on newer Dysons, mainly for the specific limited application of dusting cobwebs up in corners. There it kind of struggles a little bit, but it otherwise works well. And a lot of people, like my good friend Parwas786, have said negative things about these crevice tools, and I totally get it, but for me, I actually like having the bent crevice tool because it means when you bend it at a certain angle, you can get into areas more easily that you can't as much with the straight crevice tool, and you have that choice. Of course, the problem is that because of the way this is angled this way, it's really better if you're trying to get at things from a right angle versus a left angle where you'd be trying to get it upside down, but it's still more than good enough. My only sort of complaint is that I wish the hole still had some kind of a mesh on it instead of just being a completely open hole, because sometimes if I'm vacuuming something and it gets stuck to it, it can just suck it into that hole too and block the tool. If this had a bit of a plastic mesh on it, in a very similar vein to the DC07, I think this crevice tool would be damn near perfect. And it does click onto the side of the machine just like on the DC14, and on the 14 where the crevice tool sits flush, on the DC15 it's on a platform that pops out a little bit, so it's a little bit easier to grab the tool and pop it out and place it back on. So all that is nice. It's a little tiny little change that they made that makes it feel a little bit easier to get to the crevice tool. Now before we discuss the actual hose and wand itself more in depth, let's address this god-awful handle that Dyson US decided to put on this machine for no real reason. Now those of you in the UK will probably recognize this handle. At the very least, you'd recognize this handle if I was holding it like this and the rest of the vacuum was facing this way. For whatever reason, Dyson US decided to completely re-engineer the handle, but also not. Now, unlike the DC17 and the DC18, the former of which didn't come out in the UK, but both of which have the exact same handle as each other, those machines do also have rear-facing handles. But if you notice, on those handles are actually curved upwards. And I know because I have both of them. Those handles are actually curved upwards. So when you use the machine, in fact, let me just go grab one. So if we take a look at the DC17 Absolute, and the DC18 over there has the exact same handle as well, as you can see. So this DC17, as you can see, it also has a rear-facing handle, but on the DC17, if you noticed, it's actually curved upwards. The actual entrance of the wand is lower than the top part of the handle, and the top part of the handle is towards the back. What does this mean? It means the handle is curved upwards. So whenever you're using the machine, and you have it reclined, now the handle is much closer to being perpendicular to the floor. And depending on what angle you're vacuuming at, you might still have a downward angle on the machine. Or even if you don't, you still have your thumb being able to rest on the wand cap, and you have the bulk of your hand towards the front, and you actually have it wrapping around this handle. So that way, you actually have a good amount of leverage on it. And it's balanced in a very nice way to where it actually places the weight of the machine further away from your hand. So even though I generally prefer the front-facing handles to these rear-facing ones on most Dysons, this design actually works really well because even though the DC17 is a very heavy and bulky machine, the way that this handle is balanced and the way that Dyson very nicely balances all their machines mean that even their heaviest machines, because they all have nice handles and nice balancing and weighting, they're actually very pleasant to push and pull on 99% of carpeting. Again, remember this. See that loop? Now you see this one. See how this loop is curved downwards, not upwards? That makes a massive difference. This machine is definitely not as heavy as the DC17. It looks bulky, and it definitely is the bulkiest out of all the ball Dysons, but it's still technically not as heavy as the DC17. I don't remember the weights off the top of my head, so maybe that's wrong, but it definitely doesn't feel as heavy. But when you go to recline this with the foot pedal that the DC15 has, which we'll touch on that in a moment, and you go to use this thing, so when I'm pushing this, I'm literally stretching my wrist and I'm straining my wrist down like this, which is not natural. It's putting a lot of strain on my wrist and on my back as well. I was using this earlier, not today, but thankfully it was about a week ago when I was using this, and I went to go use the ball mechanism to twist it. And with the way I was already straining my wrist, the process of me twisting my wrist just shot a jolt of, I guess, pain or whatever you'd call it, all the way through my shoulder and down to my back. And I hurt. Like, it actually hurt. I hurt. I got injured, I guess you could say, but it wasn't really an injury, but you could clearly feel the pressure. I mean, you couldn't, but I could, on my back from that design. Now, the way I've gotten around this, as you can see, is just jamming my hand all the way towards the end of this, like this, basically having a death grip on the front of this, and with my hands basically riding the edge of the wand cap and the wand. And again, it puts a lot of strain on my finger right here because it's rubbing on this plastic right here, which is kind of sharp. It's not a good design. And I don't know why, because in the UK, I'll preface this by saying in the UK, if you look at any DC15 in the UK, it doesn't matter what version it is, this handle is identical, but it's facing towards the front, which makes sense, because this design is designed to be handled this way, not this way. It literally has the thumb grip right there. It's insane. And if you compare this to a DC14, well, if you notice, this looks just like the handle on the DC14, but just with the extra loop. But again, it's facing the wrong way. Because when they put a backwards facing handle on the DC14 here in the US, which I don't know why they did that, but very briefly, they changed the handle design on the DC14. It was like the DC17 and the DC18 where it's bent upwards, not downwards like this. This is the only Dyson to have this design. And the crazy thing is that in the US, there technically is a version of the DC15 where this is flipped around. And there's also a version of the DC15 where this handle actually is arched upwards like a DC17 and DC18. Still not to the same degree. It's more so straight than it is curved down. But in theory, that one's supposed to exist as well. Although trying to cross-reference this is kind of annoying because pictures for these are not very prominent these days of real-world units. But in theory, there should be 3 different handles for this. But here in the States, this is the one you're most likely to find, because this is the one that ran the longest. The front-facing handle wasn't introduced here in the US until they were on the route to discontinuing the DC15 in favor of the DC25. So, while that handle exists in the US, legally, we didn't really get it. And 98% of DC15s you find are going to have this back handle, and it sucks. It is terrible, and it legitimately ruins the machine. Because what are you interacting with the entire time you're using it? The friggin' handle. And this handle is garbage. I don't know why Dyson, because in the UK, they've always had the front-facing handle that's just like this, but just with the extra loop in the UK. So, I don't know why you guys in the UK got the proper handle, and for some reason Dyson's US division decided to waste money engineering this pile of crap. But this is awful. And I do wonder how many Dyson DC15s got returned because of this terrible handle design. It's awful. And it's just really frustrating because this almost is a good machine, but in practice, this makes it difficult. And because, of course, they had to be special snowflakes and change the fitting on this, then you can't just put a 14 handle on it because the hose is all different and it won't fit because this is too thick. Because if you could just put a 14 handle on it, and if it was the same 1.25" fitting, then you would be able to put the 14 handle on it more than likely. Then it wouldn't be as huge of a deal because I could just steal a handle from one of my other 14s or get a 14 handle and put it on there. But you can't. So that handle is awful. And this handle gets even worse because as we touch into the wand and everything, of course the wand cap functions the same way, but this weird, strange, small diameter fitting means that it jams on the wand cap when you try to pull the wand out. And you can force it, you can yank it, and it just keeps going, but you can literally feel it scraping against that wand cap. So, and you can feel it gets stuck on it. It's just kind of sloppy. That being said, whenever you go to lock it into the upright position, just like on the DC15, you've got the telescope reach, so you can push this button, which is thinner for some reason, but you can push this button, and of course you have no good place to hold it because of this terrible handle design, but you got to flip it over like this and hold it like this, which is super awkward. And, well, then again, I guess this would be just like the 14. It's just the other way. So I guess when you're using the wand, it's not as big of a deal. But it's still not as nice as the 17 because you don't have that little grip right there. But yeah, and then of course you can get into all your nooks and crannies. Now I had some people comment on these DC15s and say that the hose is shorter than the 14. It may be in a literal sense, but as far as like practicality, I was still able to get up pretty much the same number of stairs as the DC14. Now, I didn't directly compare them side by side, but when I ran this up my stairs, it didn't feel like it was any less steps than the 14. But it probably is. As you can see, the hose is mounted a little bit higher up than it is on the 14. But then also the hose over here is a little bit taller, so it's probably about the same length. Same with the cord and everything. So I don't think there's much of a difference there. One thing that's nice about the 15 is you've got this little channel right here where you can actually, I know I'm wearing shoes, I'm sorry, where you can actually push this down and you can lock that channel in place. And now this thing will follow you around. And as you can see, I can just kind of whip it and then it pops right back up. Now the only tiny little issue with that is it means that when you're putting the wand back in, sometimes it won't go all the way back in because this isn't wind up and you got to push it. But I mean, that's a small little complaint. I mean, that's not really anything that I would ever realistically complain about, but it's something that someone may notice or may have noticed over the last 20 years. And of course, we got the little diagram there showing us that you got to press the button to the second position because it's a 2-click button. So you got to press it in to feel the second click. And then from there, you can slide the wand down. And there's a lot of resistance to this too. It's not very easy. And then flip the wand cap down and you're done. Now, even though I've complained about the hose on this, technically speaking, because of that lock mechanism and because of how wide the stance is for the wheels, this is the most stable ball upright they made in terms of tool usage. A lot of people have complained about some other Dyson models where you go to use the hose and the whole vacuum tips over. Now that was fixed on the newest generation Dyson Ball Animal 3 because there's this little bit that sticks out and braces it. On the older generation Dyson Ball Animal 2 and Animal 1 and Kinetic and DC40 and all that stuff, if you do, as you can see, if you catch it on the side like that, it can actually slip past that. So it's hard to demonstrate it without actually having the hose out, but that is something that people have complained about. Now, I didn't find that as much of an issue with the newer ball uprights, but the fact that it can't happen on this is definitely a good point for the 15. So the more bulky design does lend itself to nicer tool usage compared to other ball uprights. And in case I forgot to mention, you press these 2 buttons on the either side of the wand once the wand is extended to pop the hose out, and you can click it back in really easily. And of course there's the helpline number, but good luck getting any parts for this thing in 2025. Now, keen-eyed viewers of this channel may notice something strange, and that's that I actually have a DC14 Cyclone on this DC15 at the exact moment, and there's a reason why. Now, first off, as you can see, the Cyclone pack between the DC14 and the DC15 are 99% identical. Now, that 2% of non-identicability, that's not a word, but it is now, is for two things. The first, most obvious visual cue is the 15's inner Cyclone shroud is always gray instead of the color of the body. I don't know if there's a reason for that. It's probably just to distinguish the part. And the other thing is another reason why I have this Cyclone on here is because of the filters. Now, the Dyson DC14 has this style of filter. And if you try to find a replacement of either of these filters, this is the style you're going to find. It has this little loop in the middle, and you grab it, and there's a piece of plastic that runs through the sponge. Whether you're finding a Dyson genuine or an aftermarket, at this point more than likely an aftermarket, because you can't really get genuine parts for these anymore. Sometimes you can get HEPA filters for 07s and 14s and pre-filters, but definitely not for the 15. Maybe I'm wrong. I'd love to be wrong on this, but even if I was, the filters are expensive. So, point is, this, as you can see, has this style of filter. Now, the DC15 has an interesting change. You can tell this is the original filter, and you can tell the person never changed it, because that's the difference there. This pearly white brand new filter, and that's 20 years. That is 20 years of usage, and this filter is still damp. That's not good. Oh wait, oh no, it's not really. Maybe a little bit. But anyways, as we can see, the way this filter is designed, it doesn't have the hole in the middle. And instead, it looks a lot closer to the newer filters on the DC18 and the DC25. Now, actually, more so the DC18, I guess. The 25 had a more newer style filter. But definitely like the DC18, where it's got this little cage in the middle, and this is all one surface. Now, this filter objectively makes a lot more sense, because you have greater surface area. This is just a better filter, because you don't have that ability for dust to get through the middle. It's not usually a problem, because as you can see, the Cyclones come out on the edges. But still, you would think they would just go with this from here on out on both models. But again, another reason why we have this is because there's a little divot here. And that divot hits this little marker right here. So as you can see, there's a red tab there that slides on the filter when you go to close it. Now this, we've seen this a lot on SIBO vacuum cleaners, but this is a mechanism designed to keep you from running the machine without a filter and damaging it, which is especially important given that there's an actual circuit board that relies on the cooling of the clean air coming out of the Cyclone to cool and run past that board in order to keep it operational. That's why this duct is so large. So, as a deterrent for people not to run their machine without a filter, they added this guard. The problem with this guard is that nowadays when you try to put in a normal DC14 filter, this guard does not like to fit. You can sometimes catch it, as you can see if I kind of do it a bunch of times, I can get it to catch. And of course you could always just manually push this out of the way, and in fact the molding marks are the exact same. So in theory, if this was your machine and you weren't about to sell this like I am, then you could just take this piece off entirely, and as long as you're careful and you don't run it without a filter, you won't have to worry about it. And now you can put the cheaper DC14 filters in here and get your machine back up and running with the new filter. But I'm lazy, so I just put a 14 Cyclone on the 15, which if you have it, that is, in theory, an option. Now, as far as the post-motor filter goes, this is strange. So, this is the post-motor filter, and as you can, it literally is built in to this bottom piece. So, this part of the housing that the bin sits on, which normally is a separate cover on the DC14 that you can actually pry off, and there's a HEPA filter underneath. On this model, the filter is actually built into this piece. So you pry off, again with a screwdriver, because this is before the era of Dyson allowing you to change your filters. This is permanently attached, but you can obviously pry it off and break it off and everything. And that would allow you to replace this filter. And this filter has this part and the actual filter material built into one piece. It's this part down here that's just a empty chassis that you can see a duct on this side where the air rushes out. Now you can find aftermarket replacements of these, but they're pretty expensive. They're like 20 bucks a piece, when normally HEPA filters for Dyson's aftermarket are like, 8 or 10 bucks a piece. So they are a little bit expensive, but you definitely can get it. Now, in theory, if your machine was taken well care of, you shouldn't have to replace this for a very long time. But if you ran it without a filter, or if you did any other crazy thing with it, like vacuuming up drywall dust or ashes or anything, or if you simply got unlucky and the seals deteriorated on your machine over time, reducing the seal on the system, then yeah, this could get dirty way more quickly and perish way faster than it otherwise would. It's designed to last at least 5 years, if not 10, under normal household usage per Dyson's own standards. I guess technically they just say 5 years. They don't really put a range on it. But from my personal experience, you can extend that to about 10 years if you do take good care of it and you use it the way you're supposed to. But generally speaking, every 5 years, good idea to replace that. But you can do it. There are tutorials out there on how to do it. I just haven't replaced this one yet, so I can't show you. So again, this is the actual Cyclone, but again, for the purpose of this demo, we're putting the 14 Cyclone back on. So just note that this is the proper one, and when I sell it, it will have the proper Cyclone on it. All right. So, what about the cleaning performance? I mean, after all, that's pretty important for a vacuum, and if you're going to talk about how well it cleans and how do you use the darn thing, well, that's also important, and we'll discuss that as well. When you want to recline the DC15, we got this big button right here that you push with your foot, and you can't really do it with your hand. I don't know if that's supposed to be like a safety mechanism or what, but you really have to heave on this thing. But when you're stepping on it normally and you're pulling it back, so it's less so of a direct step down, but you're also kind of pulling the mechanism back with your foot, so that way it pulls out of the way. And it's definitely a decent quality mechanism, even though it seems very complicated and annoying. I mean, this one's lasted 20 years. Push on it, and the whole thing reclines. And sometimes I like to give it a little bit of encouragement and push it up, because sometimes it gets a little stiff after a while. But again, this seems to be, less problematic than the DC25, at least in my experience. Now, for our controls, this was the first Dyson to have a dedicated brush roll motor with fingertip controls. And yeah, the DC14 had a clutch mechanism. This eliminates the clutch entirely, so you don't have to worry at all about clutch belts wearing out or anything like that. This has a lifetime belt and a true lifetime belt. However, the brush rolls were known to strip out, and the end caps were known to strip out after a while, and that was a problem on Dyson uprights and canisters for a long time. But as far as when we're up here, we got our power button and our brush roll shutoff. Now it's going to get loud, but I'll demonstrate these real quick. 3, 2, 1. Now, this particular machine does have a little bit of a high-pitched whine to it. That's something that a lot of these Dysons had. Now, the strange thing is that even though it has that high-pitched whine, this unit is incredibly quiet. It's legitimately one of the quietest Dyson uprights that I've ever used. And were it not for that high-pitched whine, this would be one of the nicest Dysons to use in terms of noise. I just realized I forgot to actually measure this with a decibel meter, but I guess we'll do that. I do apologize because I've made an effort to make recording the sound on these machines and reporting on the decibel levels a very important part of my reviews, especially after the Stratos controversy. However, in this case, I did remember, so we are going to measure the decibels. Now, of course, just me talking is making the sound meter spike a little bit because I am a loudmouth, but with the DC15, we're going to test the sound in a couple different spots. So first off, we're going to measure it right here. You can see my foot is right, an inch away from the nozzle. So we're going to turn this on, just idling, and see what it sounds like. Oops. Come on. All right. So I tested the sound at a few different points, and at the most important point, which is with the machine reclined and with the sound, with the microphone of this right at ear level, because you got to remember your ears are up here, your ears aren't down here. This was reporting right at 75 decibels, which, to be fair, that's pretty average for a vacuum cleaner. And despite the fact that I mentioned the high-pitched noise and that if you're in an environment that doesn't have a lot of sound dampening, it will hurt your ears to listen to that high-pitched noise in practice. I've experienced that. Whenever I was using this on my bare floors, that pitch was quite annoying, and I definitely prefer to have some headphones in blasting thrice versus actually listening to the sound of the vacuum. But objectively, in terms of the sound measurements, now obviously this isn't scientific, this is just a phone, but based on this sound measurement, 75 decibels. Now it'll be interesting to see if I can find the original spec that Dyson claims of this machine and see how well it compares to what I measured. But according to my measurement, my unscientific measurement, 75 decibels at the traditional vacuuming angle when you're just pushing and pulling the machine in the upright mode with the brush roll engaged. That's very good, even for Dyson standards, and especially by most upright standards, with a lot of cheaper uprights now being way louder than that, including the Stark Stratos, which is over 90 decibels, which is incredibly dangerous. This, thankfully, does not have that problem, so that's very good. Maybe one day I'll do some comparison between some other Dyson models and see how loud they are. I really wish I had one of those airflow meters because I would love to check the actual dust emissions of this machine, but unfortunately I don't have such a thing. So we'll skip that part, but this was, from the factory at least, a sealed system with HEPA filtration. Who knows how well that holds up now, but the place doesn't feel dusty after I vacuum it, so it's definitely better than your average bagless Walmart junk. So at least there is that. Alright, so as far as the DC15 goes, the machine itself is generally a bit heavy, but thankfully in traditional Dyson fashion, it's not quite as unwieldy whenever you're twisting and turning it, with the exception of the complaint to the handle that I mentioned earlier. So of course the ball mechanism on this, again, handle notwithstanding, is quite nice to turn and swivel. And the ball has always been the best swivel neck on any upright because of the fact that when you go to utilize the ball and actually twist around a corner, the machine is actually moving alongside that turn instead of it simply swiveling a neck. For example, the swivel on a lot of machines like the Cibo Felix tend to be way more stiff and restrictive to the point where the swivel necks aren't actually all that useful. On this, you actually have full turning, and for a first generation product, you got to give it props there, especially considering how bulky this is and how much piping and hardware there is in this design. It still manages to be relatively easy to twist and turn. Although in practice, I will say, because of the added weight and the weird discrepancies with this handle, in my personal opinion, I would still rather a DC14 over this 15 in terms of handling, because again, even though there isn't a direct swivel, there's a lot of movement on that bottom section of the housing that you can turn, especially on carpets, and the overall machine is just balanced way better. Even the DC17 is easier to use than this despite not having a swivel neck because of that better handle design, even though the machine itself is way heavier. So even though this machine is very easy to push and pull compared to other vacuums, it's still relatively poor by Dyson standards. So it makes sense why, as a first generation product, it had some teething issues like that. Those eventually got solved as we went into newer designs. But of course, most consumers would prefer the design of the DC15 if for no other reason that the mechanisms and all the hardware seems a bit more obvious and direct, as opposed to a lot of consumers don't like these newer Dysons because of the way that the release mechanisms work. And most consumers feel like they're breaking the machine, and they feel like the machine's a lot cheaper, even though this will undoubtedly last way longer than this does at a core level. Although, to be fair, these definitely do give these a good run for the money because there's no lower hoses to break on these, which has been a problem I've complained with on the new uprights. Now, as far as the brush roll, which we still got to talk on, this brush roll is a very big improvement over the DC14, and it includes a very interesting feature that we've never seen on any other Dyson product, and that is a metal base plate. Now, I don't understand why Dyson decided to put a metal baseplate on. Not that it's a bad thing per se. A lot of vacuum collectors and a lot of enthusiasts really like metal baseplates because of the way that it grounds the machine and it giving the machine a bit of a smoother feel on carpet. At least that's what they claim. In my personal experience, I actually will generally always prefer a plastic baseplate just because there's less of a worry about it potentially scraping and scratching on a floor. But of course, a lot of that will be personal preference. And it is still interesting to have a Dyson with a metal baseplate. Of course, again, I'd rather have a plastic one because you don't have to worry about these warping. But despite this metal seeming, you know, out of place on a Dyson, this is actually built very well. It's a very solid piece of stainless steel. It doesn't appear to have any major issues. Obviously, I'd be concerned if you were trying to vacuum up something wet, but you're not supposed to anyways. But in the real world, it tends to happen. Now, this brush roll is very interesting. We've got nice, stiff bristles, and these bristles are way better designed than on the DC14. This machine cleans way better. And in fact, I've daily driven the canisterized version of this cleaner head on the DC21 Stowaway, and both of these machines have been fantastic at deep cleaning carpets, which usually is not usually something that you can give Dyson credit for on these older models. Normally you have to jump up to the Dyson DC17 or the DC27, Animal 3 and 2 and all that stuff. And I will admit, the DC15 definitely is not in the same category of raw carpet cleaning as those machines. But it strikes way closer than I think people give it credit for. This machine does do decently well. Now, it's not so close that I would rather have this over any of those machines, even just in terms of raw cleaning capabilities. For whatever reason, the DC21 Stowaway still appears to clean a little bit better, despite seemingly have a nearly identical brush roll design. So I'd definitely rather a DC21, and especially if my goal is to keep carpets clean, I would definitely rather a modern Dyson Ball Animal 2 or Animal 3, because those will clean better than any older Dyson, even the DC17 in my experience. But of course, many people will argue that point, and they're perfectly okay to. Their experience may differ, after all. But for me, the DC15 is definitely a big step up from the DC14 and the DC07, but it is still a bit of a stone's throw away from the better cleaning Dysons like the DC17, DC27, the Ball Animal 2, UP13, and UP20 and UP30, which, for those that don't know, those are all just the newest models that I just mentioned. So these newer Dysons will definitely clean better. The Animal 3 is definitely a better machine in terms of cleaning and maintenance than this DC15, because you also have the anti-tangle brush roll and the smaller cleaning path, which in practice is way better. But this machine still holds its own. You still got the nice wide debris channel, which worked very well whenever I was vacuuming my bare floors earlier. It actually did a good job at picking up dog food and cat food and all that kind of stuff that gets thrown on the floor. And it did a little bit better than the DC14 did, despite in theory having the same large debris channel. For whatever reason, it works a bit better on this machine. And the pickup on bare floors is actually better than on the previous generation Ball Animal 2, like that purple one over there. Those ones with the accordion style head that have been around since the DC41 seal to the floors a bit too much and don't allow a lot of big objects to pass through. This machine does better on bare floors than those slightly older but still currently available Dyson Ball models. It only gets bested on bare floors by the newest Animal 3 because you can manually open and close those gates on both sides of the cleaner head instead of just a goofy little spot in the middle. Also, these end caps are very prone to breaking on these, which is not very good. The brush rolls actually had to be redesigned by Dyson because the early ones were stripping out, but these newer ones on this model, actually this one actually is a launch model, so maybe this might be the original brush roll then, but this one appears to be just fine and hasn't appeared to have any issues despite it being literally 20 years old, or close to it at least. This one was manufactured in 2005, so this one the title is appropriate for as far as it being 20 years old, because this one is. Of course, I don't know if the brush roll was replaced, but this one appears to be in excellent condition. Of course, the goofy little clear front on this is very clouded to the point where you can't even really see the brush roll. In the UK, there were some models of these that were solidly colored, and I feel like I like that design a little bit more because it just shows less visible dirt. But it's still cool to, in theory, have the clear design. Although, for whatever reason, Dyson did not design this cleaner head to be removable for some reason. This was the only ball vacuum of any type to not have a removable cleaner head, so you got to be very careful with these, and it makes it feel way more fragile than it actually is, because if any of those wires in this entire mechanism fail, then you're pretty much SOL, as again, parts aren't available for this. So you got to be careful, and you got to remember this cleaner head does not come off, so you got to be very careful with it. You can replace the brush roll, and you can replace the end caps, although the end caps and the brush roll are generally no longer available, but they do interchange parts from the DC21, so you can usually get away with that in a pinch. Even if it doesn't quite match, it will work and keep your DC15 up and running, because for whatever reason, at the exact moment, you can still find some parts for the DC21, but of course the days are fading with that as well. And I will be reviewing this very soon as well, and it'll be even more favorable than this machine. So you can see the big yellow ball on this machine and the very wide stance and wheels. But yeah, so this whole design is very interesting, and for being a first generation product, it is very fascinating the way that Dyson decided to do this. I would love to get some insight as to why Dyson went with the metal base plate. Maybe they just wanted to experiment and see if people reacted to it, and it seemed like nobody really cared, at least not Dyson customers. So no Dyson since, or before for that matter, has ever had a metal base plate. I guess technically this G-Force, I think, had a metal base plate, but that doesn't really count. And some final notes. If you have any blockages anywhere, you can pop this little duct off, just like you can on the DC14. It is its own duct, but, and of course the one time I'm trying to demo it, it's not coming off, but in theory you can pop this out. Why is it the one time I'm trying to demo this popping out, it's not wanting to pop out? There we go. Sometimes it gets jammed, but yes, you do have this little duct. Ooh, there's some dust in there. And you can pop that out for blockage removal. There is the changeover valve, which you can see changeover, hence the name. And if you ever want to access this brush roller to do any sort of cleaning, you can actually access it with a coin and pop the brush roller out. This is a much more user-friendly design than on the DC14 and DC07, as it allows users to actually service the brush roll themselves. So you can simply turn that with a quarter. You don't even need an actual screwdriver, and you might have to pop the machine up a little bit, but you can twist this and pop the brush roll out. This is hard to do with one hand, but in theory, I have to put this in a tripod. So you twist this up, twist that up, and then you can pop it off. Just like that, you can get access to the bearing block and everything, and it's good to clean this out every once in a while. I'm very impressed with the condition of this, because these were prone to stripping out, and you can take those paint marks off pretty easily too. I just haven't bothered to do that yet. And then here's your brush roll. It pops out just like a brush roller on a SIBO, and you can see there's our little gear in there with plenty of dust. Look at that, all that nice dust in there. And of course now you can easily pop all of the hair, not pop, you can cut all the hair off of the brush roll, and if the hair is wound too harshly, why am I struggling with the right words? And if the hair is wrapped around too tightly, you can also run some scissors along these grooves to cut the hair and the strings off, although I usually just pry it off with my fingers, and that usually works rather well. The bristles on this machine are a little worn, but they are still in good shape, with the exception of that one little bristle on the edge that's worn down pretty far. The rest of these are in good shape, though. You can tell I have very long hair, in case that wasn't obvious, and yeah, this machine definitely does struggle with that amount of hair, because this brush roll was clean when I got the machine, and I've been daily driving this for about a month, so that is pretty bad for hair wrap, but it's still an improvement over the older style brush rolls. These Helix style brush rolls get tangled with hair equally as quickly. And of course, this pales in comparison to the newest Dyson, which removes the hair automatically. But of course, there was no such technology back then. You got a metal base plate, take it or leave it. But yeah, now again, these brush rolls, there were some versions of these that had issues with stripping out and everything. This one, thankfully, has not had that issue. Just some dust in the end cap we can just kind of twist and sort of clean out, I guess. But yeah, and then when we're done, we just push it back in. We just twist it until it sits back into the cam, which is only a certain way. There we go. We feel that click in. And my complaint is very similar to a lot of the complaints I have with the Cibo vacuums, which is this just feels loose, and it makes it feel kind of cheap because it doesn't lock in very effectively. Technically, at least the Cibos have some kind of a slight twist that you can kind of lock the brush roll into place. This doesn't even have that. It's just friction, which, just like on the Cibos, I'm not really much of a fan of. I think there's better ways to go around it. Nevertheless, it does appear to work. And there's our end cap. And we can do the same for the other side too, of course. But we would just line this up. And again, just kind of trying to line this up can be a little bit tricky, especially because I got to make sure not to pop the brush roll out of where it's lined up at. Again, trying to line this up can be a little tricky because you don't really know if you're lined up with the brush roller or not. Again, trying to do this with one hand is definitely not a good showcase of this. Yeah, if I lean this back a little bit, maybe that might help me out a little bit. Maybe, I think the trick is to put the brush roll on the end cap right over that sleeve bearing, so that way that's in place, and then now put the brush roll back in like so, and then now we can kind of twist it. There we go. We can twist the brush roll with our hand until it lines up with that gear, and then this sits into place in theory. And then now, come on, this video is supposed to almost be over. There we go. Now we can, oh goodness. I'm not making this look as easy as it's supposed to be. There we go. I spun it with both of my hands, and now it's in place, and now I can twist it back down. So I just needed two hands for it. It's actually not that complicated. And then now I can use the coin to twist this back clockwise, just a quarter turn, no pun intended. And now the DC15 is back together. And all that is good. So I'm trying to remember if there was a reset button on this or not. There may or may not be. Honestly, can't remember. And this right here was my full, in-depth review of the first Dyson ball, the DC15, all floors, 20 years after its release. So this begs the final question. If you're not a vacuum collector, because obviously if you're a vacuum collector, you'll buy anything. If you're not a vacuum collector and you're just a normal consumer, should you buy one of these? Well, obviously you can't buy them new anymore unless you randomly find one somewhere. And if you did, you'd probably be better off putting it on eBay and letting someone else grab it and using that cash to fund a newer Dyson or an alternative machine. Because there aren't any parts available, and because there are some meaningful improvements, in fact a lot of meaningful improvements that have been made to the newer models, I don't think it makes sense to buy one of these in 2025, again, unless you are a vacuum collector and you just want it because it's the first Dyson ball, or for nostalgia's sake, or anything like that. Objectively, there are a lot of great improvements that are made to the newer Dyson balls. Even little things like the fact that the brush roll motor doesn't engage until you press the button all the way down, so you can't turn it on for a quick second to just quickly turn on the brush roll and let it turn back off with a depress. You'd have to actually press it on and off. Most people don't care about that, but that's just one example of many little things that have been updated and refined over the last 20 years, even going into the newest Dyson Ball Animal 3 here in the United States. Of course, overseas, you had other vacuums in between, and the DC15 might have been slightly different, but here in the United States, this is what the vast majority of our DC15s look like and how they operated. So my main conclusion is it's definitely a cool machine. It's a fascinating piece of Dyson history. I don't know if it's going to stay in the collection, though. It probably won't, only because I don't really find myself unironically using this over any newer Dyson, or any other Dyson for that matter. This is, ironically, the least interesting machine to me. So with that, even though I do like this machine, that is the conclusion to my review. Anyways, this is Intellitech Studios signing out, and I hope you all have a good one. Let me know your thoughts on the DC15 ball in the comments below, and I hope you all have a good one. Peace.